And so what we want to do is say, how has your personal life story shaped your leadership story? And secondly, how can we then at some point insert the lens and language of strength to help us go even deeper in understanding how our strengths were formed and developed along that context? It's adding another layer on that. This intentional process of reflection can truly benefit us in ways that we really aren't expecting, because many of the challenges, many of the relational challenges come from a deep unconscious patterning that we aren't necessarily aware of. And it could have been a period of our life that actually shaped that. We've never gone back to ask of that story, what's that meaning? What's that mystery meaning that lies there that we haven't learned yet? So what we're trying to do is to ask leaders to reach into this personal reservoir, their personal story, and draw out of that some leadership narratives, some truly compelling stories that are truthful, honest, and timely that they can have in their toolkit to be able to lead other people.
Hello, everyone. It's Nathan Freeberg. Welcome to the Leadership Vision Podcast, sharing our expertise in the discovery, practice, and implementation of a strengths-based approach to people, teams, and culture. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about leadership narrative and the importance of using your story, the story of the collective experiences of your life, to inform and shape who you are as a leader today. Now, I just got back from Minneapolis, or rather, I should say, by the time that you see and hear this, I will have been in Minneapolis, Rochester to be more specific, for the Flourish in Strength conference. And something that we talked about was how the brain is constantly translating our lived experience into a story. To be human is to be a carrier of a story, and how our story is shaped by our frame of reference, our commitments to relationships, and the way that we face challenges and opportunities. And the more that we can understand these things, the more that we can use them to inform how we interact with the world today. At Leadership Vision, we believe that the language of strengths can help unlock the meaning contained within our life stories. So today on the podcast, we are actually going to be resharing an episode that first released back in 2020, February of 2020, which seems like years and years and years ago. Brian and I were talking about this idea of story and leadership, and as I just re-listened to it, I thought I'd share it again because not only did I just kind of have this conference experience, which you're going to get to hear about more in the coming weeks, but also because I wonder how many of our stories have been radically altered from the events of the past 2 years. Or have they been altered at all? Or how many of us were forced to confront or remember some of the stories in our lives that have shaped who we are today, and what impact, if any, has that process had on us? As I was listening to this episode, again, I was reminded about how effective it can be to reflect on our stories. And in it, I tell a story about my first leadership experience when I was a freshman in high school. And I can connect some of my motivations in that experience, even back to, as a 14-year-old in the mid-90s. I can connect some of those things back to what still motivates me in my leadership and influence capacities today. And how I can also see some of those motivations are influenced, I think at least, in part by my strengths of communication and maximizer. But, enough about me. This episode is all about leadership narrative. And so I encourage you to listen to it and then do some of your own reflection. And then you can leave us a comment on our blog post or on social media and tell us what sorts of things have impact and influenced you and your story. And what difference does any of that make on who you are today? Enjoy.
Our personal story is the greatest reservoir that we have as leaders to reach back into those experiences, those key relationships, those spheres of influence, the lessons that we've learned, the wisdom that we've gained. It's all here wrapped up inside of us. And I believe that, as human beings, our brain is keeping those memories for us, and that it's an untapped resource of lessons that we can learn and relearn for ourselves, as well as, little bits of wisdom that we can give to other people. So I think that what we're exploring now is how is it that we can use this idea of story and narrative and ask ourselves, how can we as leaders, understand our own personal life story as a leadership narrative, then how can we go back and then mine out of our own story what those little narratives are, and then we can become storytellers that can help people, not just understand who we are better, but to also create that emotional capture that sometimes we're looking for, to be able to get the motivation from someone, because we have a motivational story to tell. Sometimes there are times in our lives when we just have clear and compelling vision that can help align others. Well, let's tell that story too. What about the difficulties? We all have those stories. So I think that what we're asking is, how can leaders for themselves press pause and ask, where did I come from? What were those shaping influences? And we're talking like from the earliest possible memory until who they are now. So that could span 40, 50, 60 decades, or even 2 decades for all that's concerned. We still have stories that will still capture our imagination and as well capture the imaginations of somebody else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when you think about how we leverage our stories, who we are, all of the vast experiences that we have, there's some of us that try to forget that and try to forget who we are and ignore who we are, and in some ways like push that down. But it is out of those experiences of our life that all those things build upon each other, right?
Well, there's good reason we're trying to forget it, Nathan.
Well, sometimes yes, but also saying, how did that horrible thing that happened to me when I was whatever years old shape and impact me, for better or worse? You try to figure out, how do I take this to go to the next step of their professional career, their personal lives, whatever it is, and you've got to, I think, start unpacking some of these things to make sense of it all.
Yeah, and the brain has an incredible capacity to not work well with cognitive dissonance. Some of our stories
just heard it in our meeting earlier,
are bad stories, or
right.
or they're negative, or for no reason of our own. It just happened to us. So what we're going to be doing cognitively is we're going to try to create a story out of that makes sense to us, because the brain is always searching for meaning. And and our brain's going to look for meaning. Our emotions, our soul is going to look for some type of harmony, even in the midst of great negativity. And in doing so, we want to make sense. We want to have meaning and order to those negative experiences. And in doing that, we may begin to, if I dare say, like just smudge the edges of truth, like what actually happened, so that the story can live in us and be a part of us. However, that doesn't mean that the story isn't any less relevant for the fact that it did hurt us and it did maybe damage us. That still has a shaping influence on who we are. So if I ask someone, even momentarily, to go back and to revisit that story and just ask oneself openly and honestly, like, what did that experience teach me about myself, my resolve, my resiliency, my values, but also how did I survive through that? And I think that that's just part of how we can learn to face the truth of our own story, be able to present that truth to other people as a way to invite them into the truth of their own story. Does that make sense? I think that the great leaders get like who they are, how to share that, to invite others to go to that same place within themselves.
Sometimes I think we create these memories that are not based in reality and truth that inform our lives going forward. And so if we take some time to sit back, reevaluate that. We don't want to revisit pain necessarily, but say, actually, maybe that is not the story that you should be telling because it's not accurate. I'm thinking of issues of like someone being like, oh, I'm very awkward in front of groups because one time in middle school, this thing happened to me. Well, actually, maybe that isn't the story. Maybe that thing that's preventing you from having different levels of influence perhaps is not accurate.
Correct. I'm going to pause on how you started that.
Yeah, please do.
By what you said, our memories are not formed in reality. Our memories are formed within the crucible of reality. It's what we do with it outside of that. If you can look at what I'm doing right now, like here's my blue pen, here's my purple pen. These are two realities. And what we'll do is we'll insert other parts of this story to make sense of this. And what the brain's trying to do is to say, like, how can this story now that's now 6 pens wide, the pens I added are all ways to adapt that story so that I'm protected, I become the hero, things happen great, but it started with maybe 2 bookends of a reality that we don't want to deal with. And so what I want to ask us, and myself included, is how can I go back into my history, honestly face the truth that I lived, and then ask myself, then how did that form who I am, shape how I am as a leader, how I form relationships, why I wrestle with trying to find emotional language to explain things, and why I'm so willing to like just jump into something just to see what happens. That's all found somewhere. And I think that the great leaders, they know how to face those memories without a great degree of fear, but to know that they can, tell a good story, not just to become a good storyteller, but to become a great leader of people. I just don't want to create this like visual of people like seeing a great leader storyteller, like someone in front of a group. I think of it more like a leader sitting around a fire. It's like, I'm just going to take my turn, around a campfire. Like, I'm going to take my turn and tell a story,
Right.
and then Nathan,
Here's my story.
you're going to take your turn, and like you're going to tell your story. And just by modeling that behavior, it just sets the table for us to really take an honest look at what's happened, the good, the bad, the ugly. How did that influence and shape us? Then how can we use that information to really craft creative narratives that can be told really quickly, but really be that emotional glue that binds people together.
Yeah. Some of this comes back to vulnerability too, right? Like as we have woven that into so much of our work, as you become more vulnerable with your own story and the way that you got there, others in turn will become more vulnerable with their stories. You create and establish deeper relational connection, which then leads to trust, which then leads to more vulnerability, and the whole cycle just continues, and it creates this really beautiful picture of a team, of a group, of an organization that has taken risks with themselves and with one another and realized, oh, I can walk with you through this thing because perhaps our stories, maybe even just a little sliver of them, have mirrored each other in some way that I would have never known.
Yep.
If we hadn't taken that time to share our stories.
And that's one of the reasons why we do it. Because if we begin to share stories that can in some way connect people with the story of someone else, there's a conscious and an unconscious connection that's being made there that's developing a deeper relationship, not just in that moment, but a relationship that we will remember that the essence of that connection down the road. Mm-hmm. And that's why we do it. I think that what we're asking people to do is we're asking people to put together strengths and story, or story and strengths. And we want to take the language of strengths and ask people to not put a strengths lens on as they're doing a personal timeline, but how can we create a personal timeline where people go through and they note all these significant things that have happened in their life, and then later on use this strengths language to go back and say, when was some of the first signs of, whatever strength you want to talk about? When did someone see that in you and draw it out? And it became more of a resilient behavioral pattern for you. I was talking to Melissa about this the other day, and Melissa was saying, Brian, that's great that your geometry teacher saw that in you and drew that out. But for Melissa said, but then there were also times where I felt that those young forming strengths were actually used by people because they saw I was good at it and they used it for their gain. I thought that was a really interesting take on it too.
Yeah, that is.
Because it still goes back to the genesis of it's an early expression of a strength. Okay, so that's true. The other truth is that people saw that and they wanted to use it to their advantage. That's also true. Now then the question like we're talking about is like, now what story does Melissa tell from that? Like how did that shape her then, and how does that shape her now? Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. And it makes me think of a story. Can I tell you a story?
What is that story? Yeah.
So when we went through this activity with our team, one of the memories that I put on my timeline that I hadn't thought about in literally decades. I'm 40 now, so I can speak in decade terminology.
That's awesome. You got decades to work with.
I know. Not a lot, but a few. But was kind of my entrance into leadership. And so Isaac Jacobs, a friend of mine in middle school and high school, I remember the moment we were sitting in the high school cafeteria, and it was time to apply for class officer positions. And I was basically complaining about some stuff in our current administration, if you will, if 12 and 13-year-olds can have that. And he says to me, Brian, it seems like you have a lot of good ideas. Why don't you run for class president? And it was the first time I'd ever considered myself, because I mean, I know this is shocking, but I wasn't in the cool group. I wasn't one of those kids yet at that age. But it never occurred to me that I could step into a position of leadership. And so I remember figuring out what I needed to do. I went to the office and they had like this packet of duties and responsibilities. I can look back at this and see perhaps when my strength of significance really popped up, because it was like, I want to have a shaping impact on my class in Manistee High School, on the school and what that looks like. And I went on to be class president for 3 years. I ran on a platform of, actually, I don't know what my platform was.
You had a platform?
But, sure, I don't know what it was. My platform was I'm organized, and my dad helped me write my speeches. But the reason I bring that up is because I hadn't thought about that, again, for decades until we did that exercise. Because now I consider myself, I volunteer for lots of stuff at my kids' school. I always feel like I want to be involved in stuff, those leadership influencing things. But before that, I don't think I had. And it stirred these memories in me of remembering what it was like to think, I can't be an influencer. I can't be someone that can have a big impact. And I wanted to always have a big impact. I just didn't know how. So this exercise, this activity, this training is fascinating for me, especially as I'm thinking into my own children and how we give them different experiences and different opportunities to not point them down a path, but just to say, what is your level of influence? Who are you as an influencer? What shaping events and activities are in your life at whatever age that may have an impact later?
And if you put those experiences on a timeline, you can kind of get a better idea.
Oh, totally. It changes the trajectory.
Time it happened. Yeah, exactly. Because sometimes, what we're naturally doing when we tell stories is we're compressing time. We're actually like shortening up maybe what really happened or how long something took. And that can be, somewhat misleading to other people. I think that when you press pause and look back and you realize, oh my gosh, that took 5 years to get through that. But I tell the story as if it was like 3 months. And so that's a reminder sometimes to leaders. Like sometimes we have these overarching valuative assumptions of people like, oh, you can do this. It's only going to take you a few months. But then if you pause and really ask yourself, like, no, I learned that over the course of that job, which was 4 years. And then the first 2 years of that job, that was a 6-year time span. But in my storytelling, I compress that. And so what I, am hoping to do is that we can even help leaders better understand that is a self-awareness of how long some things took and also a self-acceptance of others of how long something may take and someone else actually develop to the point that you would assume that they could be right now. But they just haven't had the time to put those two things together. In the process of writing this, or I've written a lot on this, obviously in the preparation of the curriculum, but I've also been asking other people what is that they're thinking. And a friend of mine named Paul said that there are often things that happen so early in life, significant things that have happened so early in life that we've simply taken them for granted as special. And when he said that, it was like, I just got stopped. I'm
Wow.
like, oh my gosh. I'm like, play that again. He said, we often take for granted the significant things that happened at such an early age that we just thought, well, they were normal and we don't really see how significant they really were. Now, Nathan, if you think of that, what were some of those things where you realize now, like, my goodness, that was a traumatic or a tremendous event that happened, and you just took it for granted. Like, well, doesn't everybody do that, or doesn't everybody get that break?
So it's funny you say that. I have something.
You do.
I do.
You just heard it for the first time just now.
Yeah. So I was talking with my son. He's 6. As part of his school, they have to. Every class has to basically lead kind of a school assembly, we'll call it. And there's different reading parts and other things that students do. And as he was preparing for it, I was like, "Hey, are you going to be reading this time?" He's like, "Oh no, I don't do that. I'm afraid to get up in front of people. I don't like doing that." He's very friendly, outgoing, but he is basically stage fright, is what it came down to. And as I was reflecting, so my dad was a pastor growing up, Christmas plays, Easter plays. I had so much experience up on stage in front of people by the time I was his age. To your point, it's just second nature. Doesn't everybody do that? And so I think that's a lot of where my natural inclination to not be afraid of kind of being in front of people has come from. But until I kind of was putting these pieces together, I just took that for granted to doesn't everybody do that? Isn't that a part of it? But realizing that, this thing that maybe I've pushed away from in some ways in my life has had a massively shaping influence on who I am today, on the type of leader I am, the things that, bring me joy and are generative and all of those things. So again, reflecting on how we got to where we are is really informative and very powerful.
And just in that short little narrative, what strengths do you think were emerging even in that?
Oh, that's easy. Communication, for sure.
How
learning
so?
Just learning how do you communicate a message in front of people when you have a limited amount of time? How do I make what I'm going to say clear and crisp? I also think there are aspects of perhaps some significance as well I want to have a big role in this play, this presentation, whatever it is, so that I can impact people. When I was a little bit older, like rehearsing and wanting lots of feedback and wanting to tweak it. Well, does this sound good if I say it this way? Or should I pause longer here for this? Hopefully laughter and other things like that, because I wanted to connect. I wanted to kind of influence these different groups when I was, presenting, again, play form, maybe reading something in church, doing something with my school, different leadership things that I had. So that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that part of it for a while.
Well, I think it's important to go there. And just in that short little exercise, that's just a demonstration of how we invite people into their own narrative.
Yeah.
And then because we happen to use the language of strengths to help people better understand who they are, we can layer on a question about strengths to help people go even a step further. Because I could even ask you that same question of, or that same like narrative you were talking about is, when was that strength of communication misapplied by someone else?
That's a good one.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. Do you want me to answer that now?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, gosh.
Because you have a way of expressing yourself, and I know that you've been in many situations throughout your decades where, that strength of communication, even in its formative years, could have been misapplied by someone, not because they were ill-intentioned, but just because they may have saw something in you, but drew it out in a way that had a negative impact.
Well, and this may not be exactly what you're asking, but I think often my communication and ideation would get maybe misapplied or almost told to like sit down and be quiet, because as I was trying to figure out what is that idea, what is that message, you kind of go around and it's the, lots of ideas, lots of things coming out, and sometimes it's like stop, focus, stop doing that. And it was like, oh, you're right. I need to be more like the person that sits down and writes out their thoughts and isn't quite as perhaps verbally, doesn't get there in the same way that I do. So if you know that about a kid, that this person just wants to talk everything out until we find an answer, you perhaps would approach that differently, right?
Absolutely.
Theoretically.
Yep. And another reason why we're asking people or asking leaders to truly investigate their story is because, like I've been saying, we really want people to understand how their personal story has shaped their leadership narrative. We also want people to kind of maybe go into that shadow side for a moment and ask themselves, like, what can a person's personal timeline tell them about their bias, tell them about some of the cognitive and behavioral conditioning that they now demonstrate, like how early that was formed. Sometimes we have a great familiarity with degenerative behaviors that we just seem to repeat those without asking ourselves, what kind of residual impact is that having on someone else? And just also repetition, not simply with the positive, but what are some mistakes or repetitive patterns of decisions that we've made that we've continuously got wrong? Who was involved in that? What situations keep recurring? We're also asking those questions. So I really believe that, this intentional process of reflection can truly benefit us in ways that we really aren't expecting, because many of the challenges, many of the relational challenges come from a deep unconscious patterning that we aren't necessarily aware of. And it could have been a period of our life that actually shaped that. We've never gone back to ask of that story, what's that meaning? What's that mystery meaning that lies there that we haven't learned yet?
So can I ask you a question about what to do with this?
Sure.
Like, if I'm going through this training, what do I do with this? So I've shared a few stories, some ahas, here's my timeline. What do I do with that? Like, how do I make that useful? I've connected it maybe to a strength or two. Like, how is that actually helpful to inform where I'm going in the future?
There are two very specific ways that we are trying to apply this personal timeline. Obviously, using strengths as a way to understand the timeline once that personal timeline has been constructed. But in this one experience, we're asking for 3 or 4 very specific things. Number one, can you create a compelling leadership narrative, like 1 to 3 to 5 sentences that truly captures what's shaped you as a leader, like how you show up, how you relate, what motivates you as a leader. Like that's objective number one, is what kind of story can you create and then present to the cohort. Number two is, can you create 3 or 4 additional quote unquote leadership narratives that get at the following? A story that is emotional, that can help people get that emotional buy-in that you're oftentimes looking for. Do you have a strong motivational story, a motivational story that can elicit motivation in others, like get them like, yes, let's go win the game, How do you have stories that can help people connect to relational loyalty? I think that we would not be where we're at without key relationships. How can we tell a compelling story there that reveals to people what relational loyalty looks like? Here's a great one, because all leaders know how to navigate through chaos. One option for creating a leadership narrative is, how do you bring calm or direction in the midst of chaos and change? Like, what story can you tell just around that? And also, what kind of story could you tell where you had a clear and compelling vision in your personal timeline, in your history, that just like shaped the next 5 to 7 years of your life? How can you boil that down into a story that can motivate others to follow vision? So what we're trying to do is ask leaders to reach into this personal reservoir, their personal story, and draw out of that some leadership narratives, some truly compelling stories that are truthful, honest, and timely, that they can have in their toolkit to be able to lead other people. And not just like in a large format, but even through like one-to-one conversations or in a team facilitation mode. Like when they're leading others, even in a team, like how do you create short, compelling stories that creates emotional and relational buy-in? I mean, that may sound like something really, really specific, but I had a mentor one time that he told me, like, every time you go into some of these meetings, you have to have 4 stories, like a personal story, an emotional story, a professional story, and then one great story, like one story in each of your pockets, because you never know when you're going to need a great story. And that lesson that he taught me is kind of this, because I didn't know what he was talking about. Like, what do you mean, like an emotional story? But I think that there are ways that leaders can begin to practice being story creators before they just show up and try to be a great storyteller.
I was listening to a podcast interview between Conan O'Brien and David Letterman, and they were talking about guests. And the best guests, they come with their stories ready to go, and they're refined, they're funny, they're relatable, to your point, they evoke some sort of emotion or do whatever it is, and they're like, man, you can just, like, those are the guests that you want back over and over and over again, because they've been so thoughtful about their story, whatever that may be, as some connection that connects to the audience, connects to the viewer. And I think about what you just said with leaders, and not that we become these robots that just like, oh, here's my story for this. But as you go back and examine your life and say, oh, here is a good story, and almost like put little tabs on them. It's like, here's a good story for this, for this, for this. And you know how to use those in very generative, helpful ways to push the mission forward, mission meaning whatever your thing is that you want to try to, carve out your space in the world.
The more familiar you get with your own timeline, like truly familiar with what's happening in each decade or each chapter of that book, the more willing you are to use some of those stories. Because I'm saying that there is a lot of self-control and a lot of discipline, like you're saying, in telling a good story. But then there's also this willingness to be vulnerable, to share a story, because you know it's going to connect whether you practice it or not.
Right. Well, and it's funny. I won't say what it is, but I have a pretty vulnerable story that I've only busted out probably 2 or 3 times in very specific situations that I'm like, yes, this is what this story was for, or this is what this experience in my life is for now, is a retelling of the story to these people, who perhaps need to hear it at this time. Thank you, Brian, for taking the time to talk about all of that over 2 years ago. And, we've actually had a version of that conversation many, many times since then. And, I always appreciate these hard and maybe a little bit difficult questions, but I think it's good to wrestle with these things. And I hope that you've got someone in your life that you can think about these things, wrestle with, maybe do some processing, figuring out, how does it impact you today? If you're interested in doing any of this type of reflection for yourself or your team, please reach out to us. You can click on the link in the show notes, or you can just go to our website, leadershipvisionconsulting.com, for more information. And we would just love to hear from you, hear this process, how it's going for you, how it's going for your team, how we might be able to help you on your own personal leadership journey and the journey of becoming more strengths-based in your team and in your organization. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Vision Podcast, sharing our expertise in the discovery, practice, and implementation of a strengths-based approach to people, teams, and culture. For more resources about developing your strengths of your team, or the strengths of your entire organization, click the link in the show notes or visit us on the web at leadershipvisionconsulting.com. I'm Nathan Freeberg, and on behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening.